First of all, thanks to Rebecca and Mackenzie for inviting me to be in conversation with Max. It's been really great to speak with you, Max, and spend some time thinking about your paintings. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah.
I guess we can start out, with the basic question that always comes up when a show opens. How long have you been developing this new body of work that you're showing?
Well, I mean, I think this body of work kind of comes up is sort of an evolution out of sort of everything sort of I've been making probably since like, 2008 or 2007. Um, I always, I've been very much in a lot of my paintings have sort of resided in this space where there's this like horizon line or tabletop or something like that that alludes to a still life in some capacity or form. Um, and I think a lot of people know me for these kind of floral still life paintings that I've been making with these vases that usually make some historical reference to art history in some capacity, whether it be a Clifford Still painting or Franz Klein or something like that. And the first one of those I made I think it was a show in 2009, and those kind of led to other things. And in this new group of paintings, I've kind of returned to sort of a smaller, more intimate scale, and sort of the subjects have become more varied and more sort of in keeping with more kind of traditional kind of still life setup, but involving sort of like these other elements that are coming into play. I think that a lot of this work, for me, like when I was growing up, my father was a painter. He made sort of large scale abstract paintings, and on Sundays I would always go up to his studio, and he would sort of set these still lives up for me, and I would work with them, and he would teach me basically about painting and these different elements and how to deal with color and that kind of thing. So in some ways, a lot of this work is kind of rooted in that sort of moment in time. My dad, passed away in 1989 when I was pretty young. And at the same time, sort of, I had this sort of I had brain surgery and that kind of thing. So I was sort of like I became I kind of evolved into this very, my life became very different at that moment. And so I think in some ways, a lot of this work is almost trying to kind of recapture that moment before that kind of traumatic experience in a lot of ways, or sort of like get back to the point where I was sort of like, I had no, there was no baggage involved. I wasn't carrying any baggage with me. So I look at this work as being very sort of kind of open and sort of free and sort of improvisational, and kind of like really trying to sort of open myself up or open myself back up to sort of those experiences that I had before, all this kind of, the trauma that I experienced. And I think that, a lot of like the show's title, like Wish You Were Here, is sort of a reference in some ways to sort of someone's passing, or not sort of having someone with you at that moment anymore. It also makes reference to the Pink Floyd song by the same name, which is also about loss as well. And sort of these paintings too came out of, I began a sort of reinvestigation of sort of these, still lives, because my wife, her aunt passed away, and her half brothers sort of set up this table of all these different objects that kind of represented who she was, and what her life was like, and things she liked, and her interests and that kind of thing. And that idea really resonated with me, that there could be this sort of, that these grouping of objects could represent an individual and sort of their moment, and sort of help you to kind of remember who they were, and their quirky side, their funny side, their serious side, all those things. And so in some ways, I use that as that sort of idea as kind of a jumping off point to these paintings in terms of how, you know, a grouping of objects could sort of in some ways represent or make reference to an individual in some capacity. So like a lot of the like things that I use within the paintings, like the owl and that kind of thing, in some ways to make reference to people that have been important to me sort of in my life. Like I think the owl in some ways kind of loosely references like Larry Pittman, who was a teacher of mine, you know, at UCLA. And also, you know, I mean, in this particular painting, it's kind of like also, I mean, I'm a bit of an insomniac, so it kind of references that as well in some capacity. So all the paintings kind of have these sort of like kind of personal references or jumping off points, or the objects are kind of something that someone has given me or that I've had around the studio that sort of represent a certain moment to me in some way, shape, or form. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but
It sets it up really nicely, I think, to kind of dig into, you know, all the different kind of ideas that you raised. And something that was really interesting that you just mentioned was your father, you know, who was an abstract painter, setting up these still lives for you to work from. And so that's a really interesting, you know, kind of lesson for you. And that, you know, kind of, I don't know if he had this idea that you work through kind of learning to do a still life and things like that before you can work more freely. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I think it's also, I mean, in some ways I always say that, you know, my first language was abstraction. So my first exposure to sort of in some ways to visual language was, in terms of painting, at least in the context of painting, was my dad's sort of kind of large scale abstract painting. So I think I always, even when I paint sort of a, you know, figurative or realistic subject, in some ways I'm looking more at the shapes and the spaces between things and sort of those kinds of, and the textures and gestures and those kinds of things, rather than in some ways, you know, the object itself, but more utilizing those kind of formal things in some ways to sort of like illuminate the object, or sort of create, you know, like the gestures and the brushwork and those kinds of things kind of create, you know, the object in some ways. And with him, what's funny is like, there was one particular time when he had set up this still life for me, and it happened to be in front of one of his sort of, you know, his paintings. And instead of painting in a background, I painted in his painting, you know, into my still life. And that almost in some ways, that moment was like an aha moment for me when I was at that age. And I still remember it. And I still even have the painting. That it sort of kind of created this like blueprint in some ways to sort of how to incorporate like historical references or the history of painting in some ways into my, you know, more recent work, like is evident in sort of like some of the floral still lives I was telling you about, where it's sort of the vases kind of, you know, become sort of a Clifford Still abstract painting in some capacity. So I like sort of weaving in always, you know, that kind of lesson that I gained when I was up in his studio sort of allow me to kind of like, in moving forward, I like sort of the idea of weaving in sort of other people's paintings or historical references in some ways always into my work.
Yeah, I mean, these visual references, and maybe Mackenzie, we could jump forward a few to a moment of reflection, the other owl painting in the show, or the Clifford Still vase. Because I wanted to ask you about those visual references. I mean, knowing that your father was an abstract painter, there's this kind of personal element to this as well as these kind of clear visual references to all these different kind of traditions. You know, you have flower painting, scroll work, and other kind of ornamentation, abstract expressionism. And I'm curious, you know, you've indicated these have very kind of personal meanings for you as well. Do you think about kind of the cultural, how you're kind of, you know, what you're doing culturally by kind of fusing these in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think about, I think to me, I always say, I mean, I think that part of the subject of my work is sort of the history of painting. And so I think that, you know, culturally, they kind of make, you know, always reference to sort of, you know, the artists that came before me, or sort of artists that I've responded to in some capacity, and even, like, down to sort of the, materials I use also kind of reference the history, of painting by using sort of these kind of older, oftentimes extinct pigments that I incorporate into my paintings, and sort of the tacks on the sides of the canvas that I use sort of reference on sort of older, kind of way of doing things. And so, I mean, that sense, I guess, culturally, I'm more, I think it's more that I choose I think, if I'm being honest, I choose my subjects based on sort of what they allow me to do as a painter. So, like, when I think, like I said, like when I saw this, like, owl that I kind of vase or statue that I kind of have been using in my work, I liked sort of, I recognized right away that his feathers would allow me to sort of create this certain color sort of juxtaposition and fusion, and sort of this different brushwork, within the details. And sort of that's what drew me to sort of that as a subject in some ways, was the physical, the physical kind of moment that it could provide me in terms of, working, and the brushwork and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if I could ask you to expand a little bit on, you mentioned your use of these kind of outdated materials, and maybe talk a little more about what they kind of conceptually add to the paintings. And we talked a little.
I think I like, I like the idea of sort of that, that painting has this kind of long history, and that I don't think it should be something that kind of should be ignored or passed over sort of in the physical kind of manifestation of the object. I think that, it's also sort of, to me, I the most important thing to me in some ways is that the moment that people have when they're standing in front of my paintings. So that physical presence that exists, that you don't get through a photograph, that you don't get through, other means. And so in some ways, I've always looked at, when I engage with a painting, whether it be mine or someone else's, I look at it as being almost this, kind of living, breathing sort of entity, where it kind of like, it has this history, it has, every brushstroke, every, application of paint that you see, even down to sort of how the canvas is wrapped around, and those kinds of things, to me, sort of create this complete, thing that you have to sort of engage with. And I really like that aspect, and I like bringing that into the work. In some ways, that's why I like, even tacking the sides of the canvas, because it gives the viewer something physical to look at when they sort of peek around the side of the painting. And again, too, that way is a very old way of sort of stretching a canvas, and sort of, I like making reference to that, and bringing sort of that past into sort of the present, of my work. So yeah.
And here's a great, illustration of that. You can see as well as the brushwork, and the variation in your brushwork, and the owl's feathers, and the wax from the candle versus kind of the more smooth handling of other surfaces in the painting. And, I think that gets us, from kind of materially how your paintings are constructed, to kind of just the question that I think a lot of these paintings raised, at least for me, was kind of where these images come from, and how you can an image. I mean, we talked a little bit about Wish You Were Here as a title that evokes, kind of personal history and memory. And I'm thinking about how, in dreams, you get these kind of odd juxtapositions, things in different scales, kind of they're sort of like dreamlike accumulations of objects that you've selected. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how it's come to you.
Yeah, well, I always, in some ways, I look at my paintings as sort of being like, they're almost like visual poems in some way, or they relate to music to a certain degree, in terms of that there's a rhythm to them, and there's a certain sort of quality in terms of sort of the transitions between the different types of brushwork and sort of how each area is treated in its own sort of distinct way. And in terms of, you know, the subjects, I feel I kind of always liked sort of taking things like, I think like, you know, the flower paintings are sort of one example of how sort of I sort of took something that was sort of like, you know, so kind of utilized throughout the history of painting, you know, this idea of floral, you know, still lives and that kind of thing. And I like the idea of sort of using that as a challenge in some capacity, to sort of how do you bring something new to that. And so I started looking at sort of like each flower within the painting as being almost like an abstract painting in and of itself. And then in terms of sort of like the other, you know, subjects, I always like the idea of like creating these sort of like moments where you take something, like I always make the comparison between some like a singer like, you know, Bob Dylan, or even like the Beastie Boys, where they take a word or take a phrase or whatever, and they almost like twist it and bend it and sometimes change the pronunciation of it in order to kind of bring a new meaning to it. And sort of, so I like taking these things like a bottle or a vase or, you know, a leaf or something like that, and sort of like twisting and bending it so it kind of reads in a visual, in a different sort of visual capacity. And I always like there was one time when there's a friend of mine that I knew came into the studio who had been, you know, in the flower business for a bazillion years, and was very well steeped in it. And he looked at my paintings and he said that he would never look at a flower in the same way again. And to me, that was like the biggest compliment, because I liked the idea that I was taking something that he had seen and looked at throughout his entire life, and I gave him sort of a different perspective or a different take on sort of how to view and engage with that thing. And so I try and do that in some ways, you know, with a lot of my subjects, whether it be a vase or a portrait or, you know, a little trinket of some sort or a leaf, like I said, and sort of try and change sort of how that's being seen, and how in some ways, like the biggest thing I would love would be, you know, someone to look at my work and then move on with their day, move on with their life, and have that that experience sort of impact sort of how they see, you know, those things in their day-to-day life, like see a flower in a different way, or see a leaf in a different way, or see a, you know, little bottle in a different way, or start noticing the space between things and sort of how that happens, and how that can kind of create sort of, you know, a different kind of meaning in your life. So
Yeah, it's about how kind of context affects meaning, and you know, as you said, how, you know, even the same object
right.
repeated in different settings can have a different meaning. You know, and it's the same, I think, with memory, the way that we remember things, and can put emphasis in different places, kind of with you know, the benefit of hindsight in some ways, or things may.
Sure. Sure.
Um, Maybe we could, you know, jump ahead. You'd mentioned some of the objects that had been arranged kind of in memory of your wife's aunt, and we have photos of, I think, two of them in the slideshow. These, uh, you know, and these appear in your paintings, and I'm wondering if you could talk about, you know, how you selected these and other objects that you incorporate into your compositions, and you know, recombine in different ways to produce the different meanings you were discussing.
Well, the one on the left of the little girl, kind of Scandinavian girl vase, my wife got when at this kind of in some ways inherited from this hotel that we stayed at in New York, and we just loved her as an object so much, and we sort of like nicknamed her kind of our little girl, almost like she was like our daughter in some ways. So I liked, you know, sort of I first sort of made a painting of her, you know, as a gift to my wife. And I liked sort of how, in some ways, like utilizing this, you know, head as sort of this vessel for flowers and that kind of thing. And sort of that's what sort of spawned a lot of the sort of the portrait paintings that utilize that sort of are more sort of, as a vase, or, like the Jessica Lange one as a vase and that kind of thing. And then on the right, the seahorse was actually my niece gave it to me when she was really young. And so I like kind of it, helps me to remember her when I had this, very strong bond with her when she was little. And sort of I liked sort of referencing her in some ways. And then also I've always just personally, for in whatever reason, felt this very strong connection to, it's because where I live, or the things I've done in my past, but I've always had this strong connection with the sea. And sort of I liked the idea that sort of it was referencing the sea, and then also it kind of then ties into sort of the self-portrait that's in the show of myself as Neptune, sort of like bringing those kind of elements together. So how kind of one painting can kind of have a conversation with another painting in the same show, and sort of but be sort of coming from different sort of angles or different perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. Here we see the seahorse,
Yeah.
in this.
Yeah, and so I liked sort of in some ways using the seahorse and then combining it with this, vase, as sort of making references, like there's, kind of different references to the horizon line, both sort of that's, kind of like the table, and then also the various horizon lines that exist within the stripes of the vase, and sort of then the space that gets created between those two objects, and how sort of the seahorse kind of overlaps the vase, but is like there's a level of transparency that exists, and then the light coming from this sort of like, almost like a sunrise or sunset or something like that, and sort of these different, it's almost like taking a still, and that's also another thing that I've always tried to do in my work, is sort of combine in some ways, like have a painting that's, like a still life painting, function as a landscape as well, or then function as an abstraction, sort of bringing in all the different genres in some ways, and kind of having them meld into one painting, be able to sort of function in that way.
Yeah, well, maybe we can end our conversation by talking about another kind of hybrid painting that you're creating here, which is those sort of portrait, floral still life, head as vase images. You mentioned the portrait of yourself as Neptune. There's also a great portrait of Jessica Lange. Could you talk about kind of an Alice Neal? Here we have how you select your subjects, and what this sort of head as vase, obviously inspired by our little girl.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What meaning does that kind of produce for you in conjunction with these specific subjects?
Yeah, no, I think that, to me, like, Jessica Lange was something like when I was growing up, I loved the King Kong movies, and or the King Kong movie, and I loved her in it, and sort of like the dual sort of existence between the King Kong and her, and that kind of dynamic that existed, and sort of I liked that whole thing. So that's why I've always sort of referenced her in some ways in a lot of my in some of my paintings, and always gone back to her as a subject for a portrait. And then like the Alice Neal painting, there was a portrait of her in the previous show at Rebecca's, and sort of I liked in some ways like bringing that back again, and sort of showing a different sort of side of her in some ways, and making her like the little girl vase, and then she has this sort of like sneaky expression on her face, and sort of that's why I like putting the strawberry there in the background, because I like, it's almost like a secret or a joke or something like that. I like that sort of aspect of things. She's someone that is an artist that I've been influenced by, and sort of really respond to her work, and also just kind of like her as this New York figure in some ways, which is where I grew up, and sort of like I was making references to New York artists and that kind of thing. And then the portrait of myself as Neptune, I really that to me, I'd done a self-portrait of myself as a little kid a long time ago, and so I'd never really done a self-portrait, and I liked sort of the idea of there was also a reference to the artist Kees van Dongen, who I really love. He did a self-portrait of himself as Neptune, so it was a reference to that, which is he's also in the show. And then also again, my kind of relationship that I have with the sea, that I've always utilized in my work, whether it be this sort of horizon line or these blues that kind of, exist. And also too, I've had this like obsession with painting, men with beards and that kind of thing. And I used to have this really kind of long, crazy beard, and then sort of I got alopecia, which sort of eliminates, I can't grow a beard anymore. So it's almost in a way trying to recapture my bearded self in some ways. And also it's really, I find it very fun to paint beards. Like in this portrait that's being shown of this earlier portrait of Kees van Dongen, I sort of took like I used his beard as almost like creating this sort of odd reference to like a Robert Ryman painting, and sort of how he used white, this lead white to sort of, show this textural brushwork and that kind of thing. So in some ways this portrait is more like about dealing with the portrait as shapes. So in some ways it kind of turns into this like abstract painting in a lot of ways. So
Yeah, and I like too, there's this suggestion in the flowers kind of blooming from your head and Allison.
yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And it ties in sort of to my previous sort of work. And I like the idea that sort of like it's showing this sort of like, whether it be sort of like an internal, expression of oneself, or, some sort of thing where it's like this sort of joy or intense joy or happiness that just sort of gets, bloomed out of your head. I kind of like that whole sort of idea. So
Yeah, there's a real sense of energy, and a real sense of energy in your flowers.
yeah,
They're not a still life. There's a
right.
real sense of creative potential in them, I think. And
Yeah, thank you, thanks.
always um, well, maybe we can take some questions.
Okay.
It looks like we have one that the question is, do you work on multiple works at the same time or one at a time?
It depends. Oftentimes when I'm, especially with the kind of smaller scale paintings, I tend to work, I tend to start a few things, but then I'll just focus on one for the entire period of time until I finish it, because I really like that, that sort of intense, focused engagement, with that subject or with that painting. And in some ways, I kind of want that to then translate to sort of how someone views and looks at it, to be able to see that sort of intense focus and intense sort of like, you know, whatever sort of, yeah, again, like focus in that particular subject.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting how there are these kind of conversations happening across your body of work. And
Yeah. Well, usually also like one thing always leads to the next. So in some ways, I kind of like resolving a painting, because then it helps me to dictate, or it'll dictate what comes next in some capacity. So
I'm interested in one callback that we didn't get to touch on. So I guess a question of my own is, I guess, Mackenzie, if you could jump back to, I guess, our second and third slides. There are these triangular motifs, both the current work and your two earlier paintings, Emotional and Omni, that I was kind of wondering if you could talk about the symbolism of these triangles for you, because they seem like,
to me, I like the idea of sort of taking just a kind of geometric form in some ways, and sort of, again, kind of imbuing it with, a different sort of, in some ways, like less structured way. Like, so for example, like I'd often referenced, peacock feathers in a lot of my paintings and that kind of thing. So Omni was sort of a way of taking sort of the peacock feather and kind of like morphing it into this sort of like, abstraction, or some sort of like, where there's this sort of like, in some ways, like a revealing this like alternative space that exists in some ways, almost like behind the painting, where you could enter into it in some ways. And then Emotional, I kind of liked, where it was, again, like taking something, that's sort of like hard edge, like a triangle, and has points and that kind of thing, and painting it sort of this like fleshy, tone and color. And then the brushwork you can't really see, but it's very sort of like gestural and sort of like soothing and moving, and that kind of thing. So I liked sort of taking those sort of almost those two opposing things and kind of blending them into sort of one painting. But I always responded to the triangle both as sort of like, I think in some ways I'd made these sort of abstract paintings of these sort of abstracted sailboats for a long time, you know, like in 2008 or something like that. And so it kind of came out of that. It was that sort of idea kind of evolved into sort of using them more as just sort of a way to kind of like kind of almost formally kind of dictate space. So
Yeah, and maybe if we could jump back one more, Mackenzie, you can see this combination, you know, of that triangular motif and the peacock feather. And
yes, I like the idea that there's sort of like harmon, like one is sort of this abstract version, and another is this like, you know, more kind of references more the actual peacock feather. And I sort of like that they're in this kind of conversation with each other and sort of in harmony, you know, as the title says, in kind of harmony with one another. And in some ways too, they're kind of like making fun of each other and sort of like, I don't know, it's just I like the dynamic that exists sort of between the two. So
yeah, I do too. It's again this kind of, you know, reiteration of a motif, but in a different context.
and then again too, it's like you can see in the close-up that the background has this very sort of kind of gestural, involved, swooping kind of brushwork, and so it has a very different sort of physical feeling and sense of space from how the sort of the peacock, you know, feathers are done, where it's this sort of like blurred, sort of thinner, you know, more lucid kind of, you know, structure. And so I like that's almost like, you know, you have this in some ways it's like the peacock feathers become a way you can enter into sort of like a different sense of space, you know, within the painting.
Yeah, exactly. We've received another question, which is about the palette in your paintings.
Mhm.
It says there's a lot of warmth in the subject matter of your work. I find the palette warmer in the pieces that feature personal references and a little cooler in ones that seem less personal. Is that purposeful or circumstantial?
I think I don't know if it's purposeful. I think it's more just I've always, I think in a lot of the sort of the newer paintings or the paintings that are in the show, I made a sort of distinct decision to sort of go back to sort of more muted, you know, palette, because I like sort of that very kind of you know, human quality about it. And also I like the fact that a lot of these colors kind of in some ways can't be quite captured in a photograph as well. And sort of I like that idea that like, you know, like I always enjoyed how like Ad Reinhardt, you know, made these paintings and he kind of purposely wanted them to sort of not be able to be photographed, not have without, you know, sort of losing so much. And sort of in some ways I like, you know, that comes into play in terms of the decision to sort of, you know, kind of have a more muted palette. And also, you know, I have this very strong affinity towards, you know, Morandi. So in some ways it kind of that return to that muted palette sort of references, you know, him and my interest with him, you know, my interest and involvement with him. So
Great. Well, thank you so much. I don't know if there are any other questions that we have. Mackenzie, are there any additional questions that I'm not seeing? Are we all good?
I think that's it. Yeah.
right.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being here.
Great.
All right.
All right.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.